Jim and I go way back to UNCW back in the 1970s, and have stayed in touch ever since. We worked together for a short time at the Blockade Runner Museum. I told this story when he was here a year ago, and I will tell it till the day I die.
Oh no.
He is largely the reason I got into graduate school at the University of South Carolina to work on my PhD. I've been at East Carolina, almost completed my master's. Talking to Jim one weekend, he said, what are you going to do? And I said, I don't know, try to find a job, I guess. And he said, well, have you thought about a PhD? Well, no, not really. Why don't you come down to Columbia? I'll introduce you to Dr. Thomas Conley, who I'm working with. And, what have you got to lose? So I got to my Jeep CJ5. I drove from Greenville to Columbia, South Carolina, hottest place in the world. And Jim said, now look, when you get to Columbia, stop and buy the best bottle of bourbon you can afford, because Tom loves bourbon. So I did, got to Jim's apartment, and a little while later, Dr. Conley came over, and we introduced each other and started talking, and then we started drinking, and we talked some more, and we drank some more, and in the evening, he got up and he said, well, Jim tells me that you want to come down here and work with me. And I said, well, it was worth the trip down to meet you. And he said, well, apply, because you're in. Absolutely true story. So a bottle of bourbon, thanks to Jim Legg, got me into PhD program. Now, getting in and getting out were two different stories, but that's part of the story. So I will forever be in debt to him. And he taught me a lot of what I know about history and artifacts, material culture, but not everything that he knows. He is North Carolinian. He's been a historical archaeologist for decades. He specializes in battlefields and weapons technology, not just American, but European. He spent a lot of time overseas. He was part of the discovery of Sergeant York's position. That's a whole nother lecture, but he was a part of that effort. And he has been with the South Carolina Institute of Archaeology and Anthropology for more than 30 years, and he is here to speak to us tonight about the 1781 siege of 96 South Carolina and modern day archaeology on it. So please welcome Mr. Jim Legg. He's worth the long introduction.
Let's hope so. So I have to follow Chris and CBS News. I should point out that 3 minutes of interview that we had on that CBS piece was distilled from 3.5 hours of interviewing on the Camden battlefield. It was 99 degrees that day. So we look a little rough, I think, and that's the reason, because we were standing out there on the tour path for 3.5 hours with 4 people from Manhattan with $1 million worth of equipment. So Steve Smith and I, Steve was my colleague who's in the CBS piece. We were fairly stunned when the director at the 96 National Historic Site got in touch with Steve and said, we have some money to spend, and we would like for you to spend it on archaeology at 96. We have enough money for you to do a field school for 3 years. Now this would be not 3 years, but three field schools of about 3.5 weeks each over a period of 3 years. It was money that was earmarked for some sort of educational purpose, and they didn't know how to spend it. They didn't want to let it go, so they asked Steve if he wanted to do archaeology in the middle of this incredible battlefield site. And that just doesn't happen. So we were really stunned that this developed. The first year, Steve did a field school on the French and Indian War period trading post at 96, which was the original manifestation of the village, Gowdy's trading post. I didn't really have much to do with that one. But in 2018 and 2019, we worked at Star Fort, which is the chief remaining element of the siege of 96. There isn't much else to see that's original there. But this is a spectacular survival of a Revolutionary War period earthwork. And I'll get into that later. So we had these two very brief field schools in 2018 and 2019. And we had very small classes. For some reason, there wasn't much interest at USC in this course. It was what's called a Maymester course, which is a course that's just fit in between semesters. And so we had very small classes, and we did, frankly, not a huge amount of excavation. But what we did find was that this place is absolutely intact. It's completely loaded. And as I say, we barely scratched the surface, but we demonstrated that it has enormous potential for future work. Okay, some background history. As we know, Charleston fell to the British in May 1780. Now, the British strategy for subduing the Carolinas and maintaining control, reestablishing royal authority, was twofold. They did not have enough regular troops to occupy Georgia and the Carolinas entirely. There were only a few thousand British regulars and provincials available. So their strategy was twofold. First, they hoped that they would be able to raise huge numbers of Loyalist militia to actually control the interior. Secondly, they established a series of interior posts at strategic locations. And these little British flags are all either coastal or interior posts that were part of that system. Now, the three most important interior posts, and they're the most interior posts, are at Augusta and 96, which is the one there on the upper left. This is 96. And Camden. So Augusta, 96, and Camden. These were all three towns or villages that were heavily fortified by the British soon after the fall of Charleston. So by the summer of 1780, you have this chain of posts, almost like fire bases or logistical bases in the interior for maintaining or establishing royal order. The system worked pretty well for the first year, and then Nathanael Greene came along. Now, we know that after the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, Greene remained in North Carolina while Cornwallis marched his army to Wilmington, and not long after that to Virginia and Yorktown. Greene, however, reinvaded South Carolina in April of 1781. And his strategy was not so much to run down and attempt to lay siege to Charleston or Savannah. He decided to begin picking off these posts in the interior. They were small. They had small numbers of regular troops, not nearly as many militia as the British had hoped to call to the flag. So they were vulnerable. And he ended up by, May 15th, he had taken Camden, Fort Mott, Fort Watson, and Fort Granby, which was located across the river from where Columbia is now. He then turned his attention to 96 again. And so he's down here at Fort Granby after the fall of Fort Granby, and he goes to 96. So, 96, as I said, was originally a little trading post village during the French and Indian War. It was occupied by the British immediately after the fall of Charleston, and it was heavily fortified. There were two forts exterior to the village, and the village itself was fortified. But the primary fortification, the strongest fortification, at 96 was this star-shaped fort. Now this is a peculiar design, but you see it a lot in the 16th and 17th century Europe. It was one of the standard designs for a small fort. It gives you a lot more directions, and a lot more directions for enfilade, for example. This is the Park Service reconstruction of what the fort may have looked like during the siege. And of course the fort is extant, so they had pretty good information for the illustration. And in the distance you can see the American siege works approaching. Greene's army began to arrive at 96 from near Columbia on May 22nd. Greene had something less than 1,000 Continentals and a few hundred militia and several 6-pounder guns. So we're not talking about a huge force here, but it was the primary American field army in the South at that time. In contrast to what we see in, for example, Civil War military history, these armies are very small. And I think most of you wouldn't be here if you didn't have some understanding of the Revolution. You know that major battles were fought between armies of 1,000 or 1,500 men, which would be the equivalent of 2 regiments in the Civil War. Greene shows up with these 900 Continentals, some militia, some guns, 6-pounder guns, significantly. Star Fort is held by approximately 400 Royal Provincials, which are those semi-regular British troops who were raised in the colonies. This is a force that is sort of midway between pretty good militia and regular British troops. So when I say provincials, that's who I'm talking about. The garrison of Star Fort itself included a couple hundred provincials and a small force of militia. And they had 3-pounder guns. Again, that's a significant point. Now this thing unfolded into a 28-day siege of Star Fort. There were other actions peripheral to 96, but the primary effort on Greene's part was to take this fortification. It overlooked 96, and if Star Fort had fallen, 96 would have fallen. The village, by the way, is maybe 400 yards to the left of this image. The thing was undertaken as a formal European siege. Greene didn't simply arrive and begin firing artillery and attacking the fort. He undertook a Vauban-style siege approach with saps and traverses and organized, excavated approaches so that he could get a storming force immediately adjacent to the fort. And this is how you did things back then, if you understood classical military science. And that's what's going on here above the fort. That's a representation of the American siege approaches. And you can see it consists of a bunch of angles that are refused so that it's very difficult to fire into the siege approach. And the idea is you get close enough that you're immediately outside of the enemy's works, and then you can storm the works if the enemy doesn't surrender. In this case, there was also an attempt to explode a mine. There was a mine tunnel dug almost under the fort. As we'll see, it was too late to use it. It wasn't finished when the siege ended. But the important thing here is it's got all these elements of a classic European siege like you would have seen in the 17th or the 18th century. Well, as I say, this went on for 28 days. On about June 17th or 16th, Greene received word that there was a very powerful British column on its way from Charleston, a column of regulars that outnumbered his army. So there was no way he would be able to deal with that force. His only option, if he was going to take Star Fort, was to go ahead and try to storm it. And that's what he did on June 18th, 1781. They were as close as you could see in that other image in terms of the siege approaches. A force of several hundred Continentals leaped out of the siege approaches and crashed their way through the abattis into the ditch, and some of them actually made it to the top of the parapet, but they were repulsed, badly repulsed, and had heavy casualties. So the storming effort was a failure. Greene thought about it for one night and then decided to evacuate. He shut off the siege. He ended it and marched away. Within a couple of days, the British relief column arrived, and the determination was that the way things were going, there was no point in trying to hold a position that was that isolated and that vulnerable in the interior. So after all this siege business, the British gave up the position after all. They very quickly trashed the fortifications of '96. They did their best to tear the woodwork and so forth out of Star Fort, and I'll get to that again as well. But they did not fill it in. It would have taken probably 2 weeks to fill this thing in with shovels and wheelbarrows. So they didn't do that, and that's why we still have it. As I say, they trashed the woodwork, the platforms, and so forth, but the fort is still there as they left it. And the fort was indeed left. It was abandoned. Nobody did anything with it. It grew up in a heavy clump of trees. Nobody knew much about it except locals. Even Benson Lossing doesn't say much about the fact that it's there in 1849. So it's not preserved. At this time, it was surrounded by cotton fields, this clump of trees. This is a 1921 plat of the property. This is what it looked like in 1969 when it was nominated for the National Register. These are actually National Register photos. So there's some archaeology coming up. There was a little bit of work done by a USC archaeologist named Edwards, who's actually a fairly mysterious character. In 1961, he dug a series of test trenches in and around the fort, and those are recorded on this map at the top that Stan South, the legendary Stanley South, did in 1970. Stan didn't do any excavation, but he mapped the fort and these Edwards test trenches. So that's the first work there is. By 1973, the Park Service is buying the property, and they want to develop this as a park. So they hired archaeologists. I've forgotten their first names, but like most archaeologists, I refer to people by their last name and their date of publication. So this is Holschlag and Rotifer in 73 to 75. What they did, it looks like they did an awful lot of excavation because they've got the siege approach completely revealed, as you can see. That's how we know exactly what it looked like. But they did not excavate the siege approach. What they did was remove the topsoil plow zone from the old cotton fields, and they were able to see the feature stain of the siege works without actually excavating these things. And that's how we normally understand things archaeologically, is you get the, for lack of a better term, the topsoil off, and then you can see anywhere that anybody has ever dug a hole, and it's plain as day. So that's what they've mapped here. They did not excavate in the fort. There's a couple of odd features here. The little square thing at the top that they revealed is actually a 19th century plantation cemetery, and the round thing is actually a tar kiln. They didn't realize that at the time they wrote their report. They speculated that it was an earlier version of Star Fort, but it's actually a tar kiln that just happens to be in the same place. So both of these excavations yielded collections of artifacts. Here is most of the material recovered by Holschlag and Rotifer for the Park Service. And this is what the Park Service did with the property, or with this portion of the property. The park is much larger than this, but here you can see where they haven't really excavated the siege approaches, but they've accentuated it with fill so that you can follow it. And the dark gray snaky thing is actually their tour path. That's their asphalt tour path. But you can also see the siege approaches. And this is a LiDAR image of the site generally. And here's Star Fort, here's the American siege approaches from the north. This is about where the village was at this crossroads, or below this crossroads. And here's the other fort that figures in the siege in 1781, Holmes Fort. Again, a LiDAR image. We use LiDAR for most of our maps in this project. This shows what Steve Smith excavated with his field school. Steve did almost all of the formal excavation, and I went off and did almost all of the metal detector coverage. So we were basically doing two different projects simultaneously. When I said we barely scratched the surface, you can see that here. This is the entirety of what Steve excavated in these 2 seasons, and it isn't much relative to the fabric of the fort. Now that's one thing, and of course that not just the Park Service, but any preservation entity worries about doing enough archaeology that you practically eliminate the original surface of a place like this. Well, as you can see, we didn't do very much. We have not eliminated much of this original fabric. And as I began with, the original fabric is absolutely there in this little fort. It's an amazingly dense and well-preserved feature. Now I'll quickly go through Steve's work. Here's a shot inside the fort in 2018. This was Steve's first major trench right through the middle of the interior. And it revealed the largest feature that was found in any of this work. And that's this, what was apparently a huge mud puddle in the middle of the fort. It doesn't look like somebody dug a deliberate pit. It's very shallow. It was full of loamy, dark soil, and it was loaded with trash. And it's right in the middle of the fort in a low spot, and that's about the best interpretation we could come up with, was that this was a poorly drained, essentially mud puddle location in the middle of the fort, and that's where they threw a lot of junk during the siege. Those are barrel hoops, by the way. There's a lot more of this. We exposed more of it than this, but there's plenty of it left for future research. Now, I mentioned that the British trashed the fort as well as they could, and they did that primarily by pulling out the timber revetments and the firing platforms around the inside of the parapet. And we found, I believe, 4 different locations where there had been a really hot fire, and we had masses of charcoal and burned clay subsoil, and we had spikes and nails and other artifacts that were burned. And this is an example. This detail right here is a trench spear that had been driven into the subsoil and then broken off. It was driven all the way down into the ancient subsoil, the undisturbed subsoil, and then the spear was broken off. And I'll show you that later. But anyway, this is all evidence of the deliberate destruction of the inside architecture of the fort. Here's another example, one of these burn locations. Here's another one. It also has a couple of cannonballs in it, a couple of 6-pounder cannonballs. This is our effort, and I'll jump ahead here. This is our effort to try to understand the architecture of the inside of the parapet, because of course a parapet on the inside of a fortification is not a 45-degree slope. If it is, it's not very usable. You need a vertical face on the inside of a parapet if you're going to use the fortification. So typically this is done with either timber facing revetments or something like gabion baskets, that sort of thing. Something to keep the earth confined in a vertical face. Now, we spent a lot of time trying to understand what was going on here, but basically it was a failure. There was a very complex feature of timber stains and spikes in the end of this trench as it went under the parapet, but we need a bigger picture. And I can really say that about everything that Steve did. The excavation was not adequate to completely explain what was going on architecturally. One of our recommendations at the end was that we need a 2-meter wide trench dug from the middle of the fort all the way outside the fort. And we would be able to see enough detail, enough architectural detail, both in the floor and in the profiles, that we could understand how the fort was built. Right now, I'd have to say it's speculation. This was a strange thing. In the middle of the second season, 2019, the Park Service delivered a group of this Southeast Conservation Corps people who, this is apparently some program like a little CCC program or something for young people that I was unaware of, so was Steve, but they helped us out for a couple of weeks. They all wore matching t-shirts and all seemed very enthusiastic. As I say, the excavations, the formal excavations, serve primarily to raise the questions that need to be answered about the architecture. My major effort, as I said, was in metal detector sampling. And these are the areas that I covered. And I have to say that what I did were samples of samples. These polygons are areas that I searched 100%. And they were placed on the basis of answering tactical questions and also avoiding features that I really didn't want to get into, like the siege approach itself. But the conditions there were very strange. I've been doing archaeological metal detecting since 1978, and I have never been any place that had the soil characteristics of 96. Basically, our metal detectors were badly impeded by the soil chemistry, by the mineral content of the soil. We got very poor depth. And, you know, somebody that's used a metal detector for 50-odd years, for me to say that is a fairly substantial statement. So each one of these polygons that I collected, while I did my best to collect each one for comparison and content, they're still loaded because anything that was more than a few inches deep is still there. But anyway, this is the extent of my coverage. The pink polygons were positive to at least some degree with siege artifacts. The yellow blocks were negative, no artifacts at all. And here's some shots of various of us metal detecting 6-pound cannonballs. There's that trench spear on the left that was driven into the subsoil and broken off. The point of that trench spear is there, but it's curled over where it was pounded into the ground. So what did all this get us in terms of information about who had what and who was doing what in the siege of Starfort? Well, I've got pretty good coverage of the artifact collection here. One of the questions that I had was what armament was used inside the fort. The provincials were supposedly armed with British weapons. They supposedly had regular British uniforms with provincial buttons, and they would have had the weapons and equipment of a British regular. That doesn't seem to have held up that well in the Southern Campaign. And there are descriptions of the provincials in the Southern Campaign looking pretty rough for various reasons. In any case, here are 4 gun parts from inside the fort, and they represent 4 completely different firearms. The thing on the left is the brass butt plate, originally from a Type G British trade gun, but it's been completely reworked. They started out with a trade gun butt plate, and they have carved it down and reused it almost certainly as a rifle butt plate, a long rifle butt plate, because that's the size and shape of it. But it did start out as a trade gun. And if you do archaeology in the southern interior, 18th century work, you find trade gun parts everywhere. I think they were like the Sears trade gun of the southern colonies. I can't tell you how many trade gun parts I found over the years. The thing on the top is the nose cap, the nose band from a French infantry musket, a Charleville model 1763-66 musket. The one in the middle is from a French carbine, either a cavalry carbine or an artillery carbine. And the piece at the bottom, finally, is the rear ramrod pipe, the brass ramrod pipe from a British musket, a regular British musket, which I would have assumed in advance would have been what everybody had in Starfort. Now, the rifle we can attribute easily, I think, to the militia. There would have been Carolina riflemen among the Loyalists, and that's probably what that's from. The French gun parts, who knows? Either the Loyalists or the Provincials might have had those. We know that even the British regulars in the Southern Campaign used captured French firearms to some degree. We've got records of that, and I've seen it in the ground on other sites. Here's some more arms-related material, accoutrement buckles. The big one on the left is a cartridge box shoulder belt buckle. The 2 little things in the middle are the tips of British bayonet scabbards, the brass tips. And G there is the frog clip from a British bayonet scabbard. Gunflints. This is the entire gunflint collection from the limited excavation. The interesting thing is these are all French gunflints. And that seems pretty strange, but it's really common on Revolutionary War sites that the British are using French gunflints. And that's because French gunflints at that time were considered the best thing you could get. And they weren't just supplied to the French military. They were part of an international market in gunflints. So the British could buy French gunflints from whoever. They were available internationally. And indeed, we found no British flints in Starfort. The 3 on the bottom are burned. That's why they look different. And we've got several sizes. Something like A and B are probably for a pistol or a rifle, while E and F are certainly musket flints. I did a really intensive analysis of the small arms ammunition. We had maybe 150 fired and unfired examples, and I also was able to get a hold of both of the previous projects, the 1961 and the 1973 to 75 excavations. And I analyzed that ammunition as well as I could, and I actually have a fair amount of experience doing that. It seems almost absurd that you could get anything out of a bunch of lead spheres because they're all round, but it's not that simple. The sizes and the manufacturing details and so forth can be very significant. So for example, the whole top row is buckshot of various sizes. The middle row over to, I guess, G and H are intermediate sizes. That's a size you would have as a rifle ball or a carbine ball or something for a fusel. The next 4 down to L are 69 caliber musket balls, the same caliber we see on Civil War sites. And that's interesting because that's the French caliber. That's the French military musket caliber. M and N, at least N certainly, are for a British 75 caliber musket, a regular musket. And N is a typical British-made contract musket ball that is absolutely spherical and shows no evidence of manufacture. That's one of the diagnostic things about British musket balls. They have been processed by tumbling after they were cast, so there's no sprue and there's no mold seam on a regular British military musket ball. O and P are complete buck and ball rounds, which again, that's an American cartridge. The French didn't use it, the British didn't use it. Everybody was aware of it, but the French Army nor the British Army used buck and ball as a rule. So these are basically American musket cartridges, and I have to attribute them to the militiamen that were inside the fort, probably armed with French muskets. And here's a really rare sight. Here is a buck and ball load actually being excavated. And believe it or not, I didn't move any of those. I didn't pick them up and brush them off or whatever. That's actually an in situ buck and ball load. And here's one of my analysis versions. I've got the 3 projects, or the first 3 groups. On the bottom, I've totaled them all. And red is fired, blue is unfired, and I've got it broken down into buckshot, large buckshot, rifle, fusel or carbine, 69 caliber musket, and 75 caliber musket. Now, what all this told me was that both sides were using a wide variety of weapons, because I broke the analysis down into material from outside the fort, which presumably originated inside the fort if it was fired, and vice versa. So I'm looking at both American and British/Loyalist ammunition usage. And it tells me that both sides had both French and British muskets, both sides had rifles, and both sides were using some sort of intermediate weapons like carbines or fusils. Now, finally to the artillery. Okay, I emphasized that the British had 3-pounder artillery, the Americans had 6-pounder artillery. There were 2 British 6-pounder balls inside Star Fort, and 7 American balls. But these had to have been fired by the Americans, and there's nothing odd about that. These are captured British cannonballs that were fired into Star Fort along with the 7 American-made balls. And I have a fairly detailed discussion here about the attributes of British cannonballs and why I know these are British cannonballs. And here's a comparison with a classic British cannonball from Braddock's expedition, which has the 2 major attributes of all British solid shot during this period, which is the broad arrow stamp and this strange saucer-shaped sprue cavity. And more about that. And here we go. This is a comparison of the British 6-pounder with the broad arrow from inside Star Fort with a 3-pound cannonball. Now, we did not find any 3-pounders during this project, but they're out there, and I actually know where to go look for them. But this example is from the powder magazine at Camden. And we have a number of those from Camden, not the battlefield, but the British garrison in downtown Camden. So that's your size comparison. And these are the American 6-pounder shot. And they're unmistakably American because they are very badly made. And I don't mean that generally, I mean it in terms of Revolutionary War period American ordnance. You can see the one on the left has this strange lamination. The one in the middle has mold halves that are not only misaligned, but they're not even the same size. And the one on the right has serious inclusion problems that's resulted in this gas bubble hole coming out on the end here. So they're very distinct. Here's our distribution map of where these cannonballs came from. Now, this is a fun story. This is my friend John Beamick. Colonel Beamick is one of by the way, he's a retired ordnance colonel. And Colonel Beamick is easily one of the top 2 or 3 authorities on black powder ordnance in the world, probably. In 1962, Second Lieutenant Beamick went to 96, and he asked the farmer who owned Starfort if he could use his metal detector at Starfort and get a sample of American projectiles, which he knew would be there from the descriptions of the battle. Farmer said, sure, no problem, knock yourself out. So John spent one afternoon there and found 10 6-pounder cannonballs. He was already traveling all over the country whenever he could, getting samples of historic ordnance. Not exactly a looter kind of guy. He was actually on a mission to understand this stuff. But there's a page from his field notes in 1962. Now, in about 1986 or 87, John was in South Carolina, and he went to the visitor center at 96 and brought his cannonballs and said, would you like to have these 10 cannonballs that I found in Starfort in 1962? And whoever was there said, no, we don't need looted artifacts. So John took his cannonballs home, and he still has them, and he's had them for 63 years. So there they are. Okay, canister. We'll look at some canister real quick. This is size distinction material. Long story short, the Americans and the British both fired some canister at Starfort. The Americans were firing this stuff, which is 6-pounder canister. Again, note the crudeness of manufacture of these projectiles. And I've got a map there of where they all came from. The red dots are these iron canister balls. The blue dots are Langridge specimens, which you're about to see in a minute. And the 2 well-separated yellow dots are lead canister balls. Here's Langridge. Langridge, of course, is a canister composed of just chopped up iron scrap. So we know the Americans were using that. And we found a couple of these lead canister balls, which are distinguished by the distortion that they receive when they're fired out of a gun like that. British 3-pounder case shot. The ball on the left is one of the American balls. The 3 on the right are British for a 3-pounder. So we don't have a British cannonball, but we have a small sample of canister. And from their locations, they're clearly British anyway, even if you didn't understand the size distinction. We found a couple of howitzer ball fragments, which is really strange because there is no mention in any of the primary sources about howitzer fire into Starfort. But we've got 1 piece each from 2 different calibers of howitzer fired at Starfort. It's kind of a mystery. We know that before Greene left Fort Granby at Columbia, there were 2 5.5-inch howitzers captured at Fort Granby. So he may have taken one of those to 96. But if so, why do we only have 1 fragment? It's strange. If the howitzers were used there, why are the fragments so rare? Anyway, there's a dissertation could be written about howitzers at 96. We have some edged weapons of various sorts. These are 2 of the trench spears that we found. The one on the right's the one you've seen before, that was broken off in the subsoil. There is a great document. There's a letter from a Major Greene, British Major Greene, who was actually the acting commander of Starfort right before the siege, where he requests the blacksmith in 96 to make these spears. And he ordered that they be placed around the interior of the parapet for whenever the fort was stormed. And there they are. We've got two of them. This was a pike head that was found in the American artillery position north of the fort. The nails were actually pretty interesting. On the right, I would say B, C, D, E, F, and G are the standard nail. We found probably 100 of those. They're basically the same wrought spike, and we found a lot of them in these charcoal deposits where the woodwork inside the fort was piled up and burned. A little bit of clothing material, a couple of shoe buckle fragments, 2 complete neck stock buckles. We did not find a single marked military button, which really surprised me. These are good period 18th century buttons. They were certainly worn by people in Starfort, but they did not have any of the regular Royal Provincial buttons, and we found no USA buttons outside the fort. But you know, we could work there tomorrow and find one. It was just happenstance, I think, that we didn't get anything. And I'm almost done. This is a selection of ceramics, mostly from that big muddy trash pit in the middle of the fort. Lots of creamware, several different creamware vessels. There's some really nice French faience there. E and F are sherds of a French faience bowl. There's not a lot of faience found on English sites in North America because, of course, it would have been a violation of the Navigation Acts. So you do tend to see it sometimes on Revolutionary War sites for that reason, because it was available. And, you know, we were in rebellion, so we could buy all the French ceramics we wanted. Now, the sherd on the lower right is problematic. That, of course, is blue-edged pearlware. The absolute early date for blue-edged pearlware is 1779, I believe. And so it's possible, but very unlikely, that sherd is actually from the occupants of Starfort. It's more likely somebody having a picnic in 1825. But I had to put it in there because it was interesting that we found it in the middle of Starfort. And here's a couple of nice creamware plates that came right out of the middle of that muddy mud hole. This was our crew in 2019. As I said, these were very small field schools. And there it is, a nice artistic photo of Starfort. As I said, this is an amazing preservation. You can go to Yorktown and a couple of other places and see Revolutionary War earthworks all day long, but they are replications. Sometimes they're in exactly the right place because they were archaeologically revealed, but the parapets are fake. This is completely original. All the Park Service has done is cut the trees off and manicure it. So anyway, this is a real treasure. Ultimately, it will yield amazing information, I think. If this thing was excavated, even 25% of it, it would be a remarkable archaeological project, and we would learn a lot about both the architecture of the fort, possibly about the siege itself, and certainly about the material culture of all the people who were involved in the siege.
Jim,
So,
what's the rough dimensions of the height and everything, right? It's hard without something to scale it to.
I used to know that.
I mean, just rough, like what?
Well, the parapet, if you stand in the bottom of the ditch, the parapet is about 15 feet high. The parapets are very impressive. Now there's
They're still 15 feet?
Yeah.
So that picture was pretty much to scale then?
Yeah. Yeah, the Park Service, the painting of the storming of the ditch, yeah, that's based on reality. Of course, it's lost some height since then, but And I should say that most of the cannonballs and the canister we found were right where that occurred. So you've got the portion of the fort that faces the siege approach, obviously would have been subjected to the most artillery fire throughout the siege, and probably got particular attention right before the storming of the fort. And that's right where we found any number of artifacts in the parapet, including cannonballs and canister. And it's still completely loaded. You know, we weren't out there to try to remove everything. We were out there to get a sample and assess the condition of the deposit. And the deposit is amazing. That's about all I can say about it.
Excuse me, what's the rough size of that fort?
Let's see. That thing in the middle is about 35 feet long. So we're talking about maybe 100 feet from point to point, 120 feet. I used to know these things. When I wrote the report, I wrote, you know, what these sizes were, but I don't remember. It's larger than it looks. And
What's the size of the fort, Jim, in terms of acreage?
I'd say it's about 2 acres. Let's go back to this real quick. Yeah, see, this thing isn't bad. We're out of the slideshow, of course, but you can see the scale of the people inside this thing, and this was done to scale, so that's about the size of it. And that, you know, that lozenge-shaped earthwork that I pointed to in the previous slide, that's that thing in the middle of the fort. So it's pretty sizable.
What's the distance from that tower outside that the American marksmen were shooting from to the fort?
We don't know where it actually was. We know they used a Martello tower, not a Martello tower, but a Maham tower. I don't know how far out the Maham tower was at any given time, but they were able to suppress the British artillery from the Maham tower. They got it close enough that they were able to keep the British from effectively using the 3-pounders. They couldn't man the guns without getting shot by the riflemen in the tower. That's where the Park Service has it now. They had to put it somewhere, so that's where they stuck the reproduction of the Maham tower. But yeah, if I'd had more time, I could have gone into detail about the siege, but that's one of the things they did that was also a nice European touch, was to have a tower to fire from into the enemy works. And they had the mine, the mine that they were preparing, that they had to abandon because the siege had to be broken off. So, and incidentally, Steve and I, some of you may have been here a couple of years ago when Steve gave a presentation about Fort Mott. And the siege approaches at Fort Mott look just like this, but on a little smaller scale. And we've exposed, you know, we've got ground penetrating radar images of the entirety of the siege approach at Fort Mott. And it also is a very European style formal approach.
Question for you?
Yeah.
So you said it was abandoned, the fort, in 1781. When approximately was it built, and at the high point, how many soldiers approximately?
200. 150 provincials and 50 loyalists inside the fort. And the rest of the force was elsewhere in the defenses of 96.
And it was built when approximately? When did the British-
It was built in the winter and spring of 80, 81. So,
Oh, so it was only there for...
yeah, it was a relatively new fortification.
Oh, wow, okay.
And it was probably accelerated when they realized that Greene was in the process of picking off all of these outposts. I'm sure after the 3rd or 4th, you know, arrival of news about that sort of thing, they probably expedited the construction of Starfort and everything else they had. There was an artillery reinforcement sent from Charleston, 2 6-pounders, I believe, but they were captured before they got to 96. So all they had were these 3-pounders and some wall guns inside 96.
Where was the tunnel that they were trying to dig into the fort?
If you look at the left-hand branch of the approach.
Can you make the slide bigger, Jim?
Yeah, somewhere up here is where they started the approach, and it's still there. The tunnel is still there. It never collapsed. The Park Service won't let anybody in it, but there's been a couple of projects to map it and actually trace its route. But when you take the tour path right here past the Maham Tower and the artillery battery, there's a place where there's a big grill in the ground to keep you from going in the tunnel, because the subsoil is so tough. This deep clay subsoil is so tough that the tunnel is just still there. Stanley South told me when he went down in there in 1970, there's a great photograph of he and another guy, 20 feet underground in this tunnel, or 15 feet. And he said it was full of beer cans and pint flasks and whatever, because apparently people like to party down there. And that was true of the whole fort, by the way. Before the Park Service bought the property, this was a big party spot. And so there was a veneer of this horrible crap that we had to get out of the way in order to do metal detector samples. And I won't go into that, but anyway, it was a very junky place until the Park Service cleaned it up for the most part. What else I've got? I've always liked this painting. I don't know if the Park Service paid for it or what, but it's certainly a spirited engagement. And while we're here, I'll tell you how the British defeated the frontal attack. Major Greene, the British commander, ordered that if the front face of the fort was attacked, he had a force ready to run out of the back of the fort and go both ways in the ditch on the outside, and attack the Americans from both sides as they attempted to get up the parapet. And that's exactly what they did. And you can see these guys have run all the way around the fort from back here, and they're attacking the Americans. Sadly, they don't show any trench spears, I don't think, but there were trench spears in use. This is an interesting group. I think this was a battalion of Virginia Continentals. I believe they were the Virginia Continentals. They were ordered to stand over here in the field off to the side and lay down suppressing musket fire, as if that would have been of any utility. But they're actually depicted in the painting. So anyway, other questions?
Jim, if you had the resources and manpower, would you excavate the entire fort now, or would you?
No, but I would do a section through one of the parapets. As I say, like,
you would leave excavations for future art.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. There's no reason to butcher the whole thing. I mean, if you compare what we know about how to do archaeology now compared to 50 years ago, there's no comparison. So.
And what will the next 50 years bring?
Right. That's what I mean. You don't. A resource like this that's protected. If they're going to put a Walmart on it, okay. Go ahead and whack the whole thing. But if it's protected, there's no reason to excavate the whole thing. As I say, what I would do if I had another little grant like that is I would dig a section from the interior floor through the revetment, through the parapet, through the ditch, and into the outside of the fort. A single 2-meter by maybe 12-meter ditch. And that would tell us everything we needed to know, I think, about the architecture of the parapet.
What is the 96? Is that like miles? 96? What is the 96? Good question.
It's a really good question. It's approximately 96 miles from, is it Chota? I forget which Upper Cherokee town it is. And given that it was originally a trading post, it probably has something to do with that. But there's also the notion that it's 96 miles from Charleston. But there's not really a route from Charleston that is 96 miles. So it's really up in the air. And people have been arguing about it since the 19th century.
And did the locals, like the owners and even just the locals in the community, did they have any idea what it was for the national park? took it over?
Yeah, in fact, they lobbied the National Park
Oh.
Service. The bicentennial was coming up, and they were very proud of the fort, but it was still privately owned. It was still, like I say, it was a patch of woods and a cotton field. And but locals knew what it was. There's nothing else. They partied there when they were kids. So they lobbied the National Park Service to have the thing made into a park. And as we know, in about 1970 or 71, the Park Service actually, made the decision to do it. In 73 to 75, they did the archaeology at Star Fort and a couple of other places in town. I'm trying to think. I'm thinking it was about 79 when the park opened, but I could be mistaken. I did, the last work I did on this project was when we wrote the report in 2020. So details like that have eluded me at this point. I'm like Chris, I'm not sure where my car keys are.
And it's only going to get worse.
That's what Tori always says. Any other questions?
What about casualties there? Did they haul the bodies off or?
I think they're in the ditch.
Okay.
The Americans were probably not recovered by the Americans. They were probably left in the ditch. And the British left within the next 2 days after trashing the fort. I suspect that there's a place in that ditch where they filled in part of the ditch on the dead. And we speculated about that the whole time we were out there. And I've speculated about it more since I know, for example, how the dead were treated at the Battle of Camden. They weren't buried, they were disposed of. So they're probably in the ditch.